I'm Victoria Dittmar, Inside Crime's lead investigator for Mexico. For several years, we have been investigating the evolution of the illicit fentanyl trade from Mexico, interviewing dozens of independent producers and traffickers in places like Sinaloa and Baja California, as well as suppliers of precursor chemicals in China. Through this work, we have documented how different actors and networks operate this profitable business, which has contributed to thousands of overdoses in North American countries and has been at the center of diplomatic tensions between the United States, Mexico, and China. But fentanyl production in Mexico looks very different today compared to just a few years ago. Governments have stepped up their efforts to disrupt the supply chain. Drug prices have dropped, and some criminal organizations in Mexico have even imposed their own restrictions on fentanyl production. Still, in our latest investigation, we found that criminal networks continue to adapt and find ways to operate, highlighting just how dynamic organized crime can be. This is a summary of the latest chapter of the story, called How Fentanyl Producers in Mexico Are Adapting to a Challenging Market. Read by me, Victoria Dittmar. We have changed the name of our sources to protect their identities. When Mario heard the news in mid-May 2023, he immediately suspended his operations. After 5 years of booming fentanyl trafficking in the northwestern state of Sinaloa, the bosses, as he called the Sinaloa cartel faction of the Chapitos, issued a blunt directive: stop all production in the state. Sinaloa had long been the epicenter in Mexico of illicit fentanyl production. According to U.S. authorities, the Chapitos, the sons of the infamous drug lord Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, were among the key figures driving this epidemic. They told us, burn everything, the business is over. Mario recounted to Inside Crime at a seafood restaurant in Culiacán, the state capital, in September 2023. Since then, he has been out of work. Mario is like most fentanyl producers Inside Crime has met over the last couple of years. He considers himself 100% independent from any criminal organization. Although he operated within the Chapitos' controlled territory for years, he did not depend on them for his activities, nor reported to them. He sourced the materials, managed the chemical processes, hired security, and found clients himself. By his estimation, there were dozens of producers like him in Culiacán. But his independence had limits. When the Chapitos gave an order, compliance was the only option. Defiance meant death. We all had to stop, Mario said. 7 other independent fentanyl producers interviewed by Inside Crime in Culiacán echoed his account. Though the reasons behind the prohibition were not entirely clear to producers, many agreed that it came at a time of crisis for the fentanyl market. Prices had plummeted, authorities were ramping up efforts to disrupt the supply chain, and China, the main source of precursor chemicals, had tightened restrictions on some of the key substances used in production. For producers like Mario, abandoning the business seemed like the wisest choice. Right now, it's not worth it. Things are way too complicated, said another producer interviewed in March 2024. Notwithstanding the recent rise in seizures in Mexico, official data suggested that supply slowed following the ban. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, for example, seized almost 22,000 pounds of fentanyl during fiscal year 2024, down from 27,000 pounds in fiscal year 2023. Meanwhile, the Mexican army reported the seizure of 1,500 kilograms of powder and 11.6 million pills in 2023. Notwithstanding the recent rise in seizures in Mexico, official data suggested that supply slowed following the ban. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, for example, seized almost 22,000 pounds of fentanyl during fiscal year 2024, down from 27,000 pounds in fiscal year 2023. Meanwhile, the Mexican army reported the seizure of 1,500 kilograms of powder and 11.6 million pills in 2023. As of July 2024, they had only seized 160 kilograms and 1.3 million pills. And for the first time in more than a decade, fentanyl overdoses in the United States fell, decreasing by roughly 17% in 2024 compared to the previous years. Some attributed these changes to prevention and harm reduction efforts. Others, like the US Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, credited operations targeting cartels. However, findings from our investigation add further complexities. After 3 years of tracking the synthetic drug supply chain in Mexico, we found that while fentanyl flows may have temporarily slowed and producers like Mario were forced to stop, the market is unlikely to be declining. On the contrary, it may be maturing. Fentanyl producers appear to be adapting to challenges, in line with the global trend of constant evolution in synthetic drug markets. Next, we explain 4 ways this adaptation is unfolding. Centralizing control in Sinaloa. This first strategy comes from the Chapitos and other factions of the Sinaloa cartel. While their prohibition did not entirely stop production in the state, it significantly raised the barriers to entry. Before the prohibition, independent producers interviewed by Inside Crime in Culiacán described setting up a fentanyl production operation as a relatively simple process. First, the necessary chemical precursors and other materials were readily accessible. In Culiacán, for example, networks of brokers specialized in connecting producers with suppliers of these substances in China and other countries, or collected the substances themselves and then distributed them, mostly within the city. "You can get the materials on every corner here," said Mario. Second, learning to produce fentanyl required little more than access to a recipe, with no need for advanced knowledge of chemistry. These recipes could be purchased directly from suppliers in China or taught by amateur chemists. The know-how would then spread among production cells. Mario, for example, learned to cook fentanyl while working as an assistant in another lab. The initial investment was also manageable. Independent producers reported spending around $60,000 to set up their labs, who even claimed to have received funding from independent criminal investors. These low barriers to entry allowed fentanyl production to flourish in Culiacán, according to the sources. And there was no shortage of buyers, a typical moniker referring to a large criminal organization operating along the border that transports the finished product. In some important ways, the model was a victim of its own success. Fierce competition among producers drove prices down by nearly half. Several producers claimed that the wholesale price of a kilogram of pure fentanyl dropped from around $7,000 in Mexico and $15,000 at the border in 2022 to about $3,000 and $7,000 respectively in 2023. In other words, the price was reduced by half. There were also significant variations in the purity of the final products. In 2022, for example, DEA analysis of fentanyl seizures revealed purity levels ranging from 0.07% to 81.5%. This inconsistency meant users could never predict which dose might be lethal. Inevitably, the increased scrutiny from authorities across the supply chain and the attention attracted by the multiple actors involved in the process proved bad for business. The Chapitos ban changed the rules of the game. To continue operating, producers in Sinaloa needed more than access to materials and know-how. They also required permission, not just from the Chapitos, but also from other major factions of the Sinaloa cartel. In addition, producers had to invest significantly more resources, both human and financial, to operate clandestinely, an option few could afford. Before, anyone could get the recipe, but now there are rules, and not everyone dares to take the risk, said a fentanyl producer currently imprisoned in the Aguaruto Penitentiary near Culiacán during a phone call with Inside Crime. Gaining permission from the Sinaloa cartel factions is not straightforward and relies heavily on trust. An individual experienced in methamphetamine and fentanyl production explained that trust is gained by having family or other personal connections in the organization that can serve as references and collateral. Producers must also prove that they can maintain a low profile. Even then, building such a relationship could take years. Getting the ingredients is easy. Permission is the hardest part, the producer noted from his home in a rural community an hour from downtown Culiacán. It is unclear how many producers currently have the permission to manufacture fentanyl in Culiacán, but sources said the number is likely small, with operations confined to remote areas, such as Sinaloa's mountains, to the east of the city. It's a very selective group, they're being more cautious, said a coordinator of multiple synthetic drug labs who claims to have worked for various Sinaloa cartel factions. The effects of this tighter control over fentanyl production may be beginning to show. For example, during our fieldwork, we found that with each visit to Culiacán, accessing sources with knowledge of the fentanyl trade became increasingly difficult. Even individuals we had interviewed multiple times, such as the lab coordinator, heightened their security measures, agreeing to shorter meetings or opting for phone calls through trusted intermediaries. Additionally, concentration of production in fewer hands appears to have affected fentanyl prices in Sinaloa. In August 2024, both the lab coordinator and another producer reported that the wholesale price for a kilogram of fentanyl in Culiacán had risen from $3,000 to $6,000. Purity levels may also be stabilizing. According to the DEA's latest analysis, 5 out of 10 seized pills contain a lethal dose in 2024, compared to 7 out of 10 in 2023. While this cannot necessarily be attributed to the Chapitos prohibition, it suggests greater consistency in production methods. It is unclear whether Mexican authorities see these dynamics in the same way. Inside Crime sent multiple interview requests to the Ministry of Defense, the National Guard, the Navy, and the Attorney General's office for their perspectives on the evolution of fentanyl trafficking. We either received no response or had our requests denied. What's more, in public statements, the federal government largely maintains its long-standing denial of fentanyl production, a stance that has persisted since the administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. However, local law enforcement officials in Baja California and Chihuahua stated that they continue to trace most fentanyl seizures at the border back to criminal networks in Sinaloa. Seizure statistics from federal authorities further support this view. While there are no official statistics on fentanyl labs, the Attorney General's office continued to report fentanyl precursor seizures in Culiacán and its surrounding areas, even after the Chapitos prohibition in May 2023. Migrating production. With the inability to continue operations in Sinaloa, some independent producers reportedly accepted offers from other criminal groups to continue their work elsewhere. At least 7 individuals involved in various aspects of the fentanyl trade in Sinaloa confirmed that these offers mainly came from groups operating in the northern states of Sonora and Baja California, close to the US-Mexico border. These groups are largely under the umbrella of the Sinaloa cartel, but are semi-independent and frequently engage in conflicts with one another. The offers to relocate and work with these groups were financially appealing. An independent producer interviewed in Culiacán, for example, stated he was offered a salary in Baja California of approximately $1,200 per kilogram produced. Before the ban, that same amount had to be divided among 6 associates. He said that most of the producers he knew had taken these offers. In some ways, moving production north did not significantly change the operational challenges. For instance, acquiring chemical precursors and other materials could still be done through the same contacts with Chinese suppliers. Criminal organizations in these territories could also provide infrastructure to facilitate the transportation of substances, or could directly control the supply of these materials to producers. Additionally, producing fentanyl closer to the border was strategic, as it reduced transportation costs from Sinaloa for these cartel factions. However, operating in highly volatile territories with constant competition among different criminal organizations meant sacrificing independence. The producers we interviewed said migrating required aligning with one of these groups. This alignment meant selling only to approved buyers, meeting production quotas, and investing more in security to protect against rival groups, an issue they did not face in Culiacán before the ban. Moreover, they had to adhere to strict orders to maintain a low profile. "I just follow orders, I can't afford to ask questions," said a cook we interviewed in Tijuana. For some producers, these risks were a necessary evil, particularly for those with limited experience in other drug markets. Many left simply because this, meaning fentanyl production, is what they know how to do. They join other factions to keep doing the same thing, said the producer currently serving a sentence at the Guaruto prison in Culiacán. But for others, including Mario, the risk outweighed the benefits. For them, security was paramount. Prior to the ban in Culiacán, they had access to protection networks established by the Chapitos, and they doubted they could obtain the same security in unfamiliar territory. As a result, they returned to other ventures, such as methamphetamine and heroin production. "I'm not leaving Sinaloa. I don't know anyone there, and I wouldn't know who I'm dealing with," said the independent producer who had been offered to move to Baja California. Adapting production methods. Fentanyl producers in Mexico are on a steep learning curve, partly driven by increasingly strict regulations and enforcement over the supply chain of precursor chemicals. A similar process occurred in Mexico's methamphetamine market. Starting in the late 2000s and early 2010, Mexican producers transitioned from relying on highly regulated precursor chemicals imported from abroad to synthesizing them locally from less regulated precursors and other essential chemicals. While Mexico's fentanyl market has not yet fully reached this stage, producers seem to be heading in that direction. The most recent regulatory changes came in August 2024, when China imposed stricter controls on 1-BOC4AP and 4AP. These are two substances widely used as fentanyl precursors by producers in Sinaloa, according to our interviews and U.S. law enforcement investigations. During our fieldwork in Sinaloa that month, sources reported that access to these substances had become increasingly difficult over the past year, leading to occasional production shortages. This was not the first time producers faced such challenges. When fentanyl production began in Mexico, producers reportedly relied on AMPP and NPP. However, after China implemented stricter controls on these chemicals in 2019, several producers shifted to using other substances provided by Chinese suppliers. Following the most recent restrictions, producers adapted once again. According to several producers we interviewed, the first adjustment was to increase the volume of fentanyl they had already produced by mixing it with other substances. These included xylazine, a non-opioid sedative mainly used in veterinary medicine. The mixture reportedly allowed producers to compensate for the fentanyl shortage they were temporarily facing while still producing a substance with a depressant effect. Obtaining xylazine was not difficult. While the sedative is legally accessible in Mexico only to veterinarians, or with a prescription, two veterinary sources indicated that diversion of xylazine is common. They added that this was due to a lack of resources, corruption, or coercion towards health authorities. For example, the synthetic drug lab coordinator we interviewed in Culiacán explained that his production cell obtained xylazine through contacts at rodeos in rural Culiacán. These contacts justified the purchases by claiming they needed to treat horses. They would buy excess quantities and sell the surplus. It is also possible that production networks sourced xylazine from abroad. In May 2024, a court in the Central District of California indicted a Chinese chemical company and 3 of its senior employees for selling fentanyl precursors and xylazine that authorities claim were to be used for the production of illicit drugs. According to the press release, Mexico was one of their most profitable markets. In our own research, we found many websites on the ClearNet selling xylazine and shipping it abroad. A simple Google search for xylazine worldwide shipping, conducted from Mexico, yielded several results from websites in China, India, and European countries. Although most of them advertised the substance for veterinary purposes, they appeared to sell it without asking customers for specific requirements. There were also websites specifically advertising it as a drug. For example, a Chinese website called TG Chemicals, which we previously identified as a precursor chemical purveyor, described xylazine as a substance fit for human consumption. It makes people drowsy, slows brain activity, relaxes the muscle, and slows heart rate and breathing, reads the product description, which was selling it for as little as $7 per 5 milliliter, and promised worldwide shipping. To be sure, the mixing of xylazine with fentanyl could occur at any stage of the supply chain and has likely been happening in the United States for several years, particularly at the retail level. For its part, the DA's National Forensic Laboratory System began detecting a surge of xylazine in fentanyl samples as early as 2019, when Mexican drug trafficking organizations were still in the early stages of fentanyl production. US prosecutors have also linked direct sales of xylazine from China to the United States. Meanwhile, in Culiacán, fentanyl producers had also begun adapting to supply chain disruptions. During our visit in August 2024, sources reported the adoption of a new precursor chemical sourced from China to substitute for the ones recently scheduled. A new formula is being used. It is bought from China along with the chemicals, said one of the producers. All of our sources declined to provide details or specific names, either because they were not authorized to do so or wanted to avoid attracting the attention of authorities. So, we turned to Chinese chemical companies operating on the ClearNet and dark web to see if we could find this information. To do this, we reconnected with vendors we had spoken to during a previous investigation into the precursor chemical trade from China. We found that many of the sites we had previously identified continued to operate under the same names and usernames. And while other platforms had gone down, new ones had appeared, or had merged with other platforms, or had simply switched sites. Still, although they were still operational, they were also less responsive, more skeptical of our questions, or sometimes intentionally evasive. Whereas before, we connected within days, this time it took 4 months before we finally received a reply from a seller. The company, Wanyang Biotechnology, had spoken to us before, and we asked if they were still selling 222 and 79. These are codes for 1-BOC4AP and 1-BOC4-piperidone, the chemicals that fentanyl producers in Mexico said were scarce following the implementation of new regulations in China. They responded that they were still selling those products, but they also suggested alternatives, specifically 1-BOC4-hydroxypiperidine and 2-phenylethyl bromide. The reason, according to the seller, was that it had better price and a higher quality, which they claimed was an improvement on the previous substances used to manufacture fentanyl. Another benefit was the lack of restrictions over their sale. While 2-phenylethyl bromide is currently monitored in Mexico for its dual use, and the DEA submitted a request in October 2024 to schedule it as a List 1 chemical, it is not controlled in China. Meanwhile, as of December 2024, 1-BOC4-hydroxypiperidine is not scheduled in China, Mexico, or the United States. We also asked the seller if they could explain how to use these chemicals to produce fentanyl. Unlike our previous interactions with them last year, they refused to share the recipe. Instead, they insisted that the purchase must be completed first. As it was during our previous interactions, payment options were limited to cryptocurrencies. Afterwards, we asked about shipping to Mexico. The vendor claimed that they could ship through standard courier services, guaranteeing 100% delivery. They added that shipments could be sent from China or from warehouses in Hong Kong, Australia, the United States, or Europe. They ended their email with another push. Will you order 25 kilos this time? What is your payment method? We did not respond further. Experimenting with new synthetic drugs. Mexican fentanyl producers are beginning to show early signs of involvement in new synthetic drug markets, in an apparent effort to diversify and keep up with global trends. Two sources in Culiacán, for example, revealed they had recently started producing Tusi. Often referred to as pink cocaine, Tusi now includes various combinations of synthetic drugs, typically blending a stimulant and a depressant. In Culiacán, sources told Inside Crime that the most common mixture they were employing included fentanyl, methamphetamine, benzodiazepines, caffeine, and paracetamol. Tusi is gaining significant popularity across Latin America, but the market in Mexico is still emerging. Dealers currently target a high-end market, the producer said, with a single dose costing upwards of $100. Right now, it's a small business, but I think it will grow. The profits are very good. said a Tusi producer we interviewed in the Culiacan area. Another emerging concern is a possible entry of Mexican producers into new synthetic opioid markets. A recent United Nations report noted a decline in the presence of new fentanyl analogs in global illicit markets in 2023. However, authorities have observed a rise in nitazines, a class of synthetic opioids with some analogs up to 43 times more potent than fentanyl. The evidence of Mexican producers' involvement in this market is currently limited, and perhaps in the early stages. For their part, Mexican authorities have not reported any seizures of nitazines and have not issued alerts about their presence in the drug supply. Similarly, all U.S. judicial cases involving nitazine distribution and trafficking that we could find showed no connections to Mexico. In our fieldwork in Sinaloa and Baja California, we found that local producers were already familiar with the names of these substances, and some even claimed to have bought them from China. Yet, their understanding seemed limited. For example, 3 producers referred to nitazines as precursors for fentanyl, or as compounds they could use in the formula, not as separate opioids. It's all part of the same thing. It's all part of the fentanyl component, said the lab coordinator in Culiacan. Another producer based in Culiacan said he had heard of nitazines and knew about other producers who bought them from China. But he said, "I don't understand how to use them." Still, in our research into the dark web and clearnet sites, we found that novel synthetic opioid markets were well advanced. Sellers, mainly in China but also operating in other regions of the world, actively advertise various types of nitazines as the newest and strongest opioids. We reached out to some of them to inquire about their products. The only one that responded was behind a dark website called Meth Crystals, which sold different drugs and claimed to ship from California. In their communications with us, the seller implied that they regularly ship to Latin American countries, and they claimed to have just sold 4 kilograms of protonitazine to a buyer in Venezuela. When asked, the seller declined to give information about his clients. "We do not disclose information about our clients under any pretext," the website read. This was how fentanyl producers in Mexico are adapting to a challenging market. The latest chapter of Inside Crime's investigation into the flow of synthetic drugs and precursor chemicals in Mexico. Published on January 22nd. Written by me, Victoria Dittmar, and Paulina Rios. For more audio stories, podcasts, and long-form narrative journalism, be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, and YouTube. And to read the rest of the investigation, or more of our coverage on organized crime in the Americas, go to insidecrime.org.